the reality of New York being a center of fashion, the New York Stock Exchange, Wall Street, entertainment, Broadway. And so in a lot of ways, there is this incredible vibrancy and energy and sense of opportunity in the culmination of human potential. I want to go into the secular city. I want to deepen my understanding of how faith can translate in this place and can thrive here and actually answer some of the deepest questions and longings that find themselves. But I also realize I need to be formed by this place too, and that I'm not just coming in with a cape on to try to rescue the city. It will humble you very quickly. We have a lot to reflect and to grieve about the history of the past. The things that are turning people off and away from the church aren't just the ideas of Marx and Freud and Nietzsche. It's also what actually happened.
Christianity was used as a means of justifying slavery, and then churches were the first place that people went to go and celebrate on Juneteenth. Can you just talk me through the way that you are able to sit in that contrast, in that tension? Welcome to another episode of Re-enchanting, the podcast brought to you by Seen and Unseen, where we, Justin Brierley and I, Belle Tindall, along with our guests, ponder whether this materialistic, arguably disenchanted world can and should be re-enchanted by the wonder and the mystery of the Christian story once more.
And we're really looking forward to being joined today from across the pond by Rasool Berry, who serves as teaching pastor of the Bridge Church in Brooklyn, New York. He hosts the Where You're From podcast, which he's had me on before, and is the writer, producer and host of the Juneteenth Faith and Freedom feature-length documentary. We're going to be finding out all about that as well in the course of today's conversation. Today, though, really, we're going to start by talking to Rasool about re-enchanting the city. That's where we're going to begin, isn't it, Belle?
Indeed. Well, almost. That's almost where we're going to begin. We have a little start block that we cannot skip over. We always ask the same question because usually we're in our city. We're in London on the top of Lambeth Palace Library. And so I'm very intrigued, Rasool. What are you reading at the moment?
Yes. Well, I'm excited to be a part. And one of the things, I think you might have to amend the question a little bit to what are you reading or listening to, right? Because now we have audiobooks, right? And my little life hack, because as I prepare for podcast hosts like I did with Justin, I like to speed read with the Audible in my ear, because you can it enhances the reading comprehension. And
Wait, you do both at the same time?
I do both. So what I do is I put the audio book at depending on how fast the person talks, between 2.5 to 3 times fast. And then I read at the same time, just in case I need to highlight something of particular note, because oftentimes in a book, you'll have 80% that's a setup. And then there's 20% that you're like, wait a minute, I got to really capture this idea and thought. And so in that method, I can get through a book in about 3 hours.
I've never heard of someone both reading and listening to the book at the same time. But is this a proven method of kind of really imbibing the information at a deeper level?
I don't know. I have no empirical evidence other than my own experience. And I'll say that necessity is the mother of invention. And so there were a couple of times when I had to power through a book before I had to interview somebody. And it was the quickest way for me to do it. But the cool thing about it, too, is when I am getting books, authors from across the pond, which I have been recently, I get to kind of listen in that accent, which is so amazing, too, that you guys have. So just yesterday and this morning, I was digging into Strange New World by Carl Trueman, and What God Has to Say About Our Bodies by Sam Allberry. and then also before that, Born Again This Way. I've been doing a series at our church, a Bible study called A Better Story, A Biblical Vision for Sex, Gender, and Being Human. And so I've been kind of leaning into this, the thought leaders and folks who've thought about on a very deep level the ideas of what does it mean to think of ourselves and our humanity in the 21st century, and trying to conceptualize it from that standpoint. And those books have been helpful for me in that.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. I guess those are the kinds of big issues and concerns that you're meeting, in the kind of job you do, the church that you pastor. What does the average day look like for you, if there is such a thing, Rasool, when it comes to being a New York City pastor?
Well, I think I need to frame kind of some of the reality that we live in. So in general, in the States, about 1 out of 4 pastors are bivocational in general. And in the African-American context, it's more like 48%. So basically half. And I do fit into that category of the 50% who are bivocational. And in my case, I work as a content developer at Our Daily Bread Ministries. And in that regard, we have the opportunity to create content that is both in the reading literature component as well as the visual and audio component. So as you mentioned, there's a podcast, Where You're From. I've also created video content. I did a documentary series a few years ago called In Pursuit of Jesus, where I went around the world and talked to people about faith who both follow Jesus or didn't, and just to kind of understand how culture could inform the way I understood Jesus differently. And then more recently, the Juneteenth Faith and Freedom documentary and things like that. So that's kind of the day job, is Our Daily Bread Ministries. And then apart from that, the great thing about being part of a pastoral team with our lead pastor, James Roberson, is I get to kind of focus on teaching Bible study, preparing sermons, which I'm in a rotation of doing. And in general, and I think the one other component to that I think is relevant is because this is now the 8th city I've lived in, and most of those have been through ministry context. And this is the most mentally health challenged city that I've ever been a part of, in terms of just the abundance of issues of depression, anxiety, isolation, what people call crowded loneliness that is experienced in New York City. So that's something that we have spent a great deal of energy reaching out to folks in our congregation, working with even mental health professionals to destigmatize, but also just provide the care that people need. So that has been a big part of what I do on a day in, day out basis as well.
Well, one of our questions, actually, which now seems a good time to slot in, is New York is such a romanticized city. Like, it's movies, films, all of that, songs dedicated to it. I've never been myself, sadly. I'm more than that. So I'd just be really fascinated. And you kind of touched on it there, but I'd love you to expand a little bit. What is the reality of living in New York in 2024? The highs and the lows. Can you give us an insider's perspective?
Yeah, it's funny. One of the probably most poignant sentiments that I can think of about describing New York actually came from another one of your countrymen, John Lennon, the late John Lennon in the 70s, where he described it in his mind as the center of the universe, right? And regardless of if that's true or not, that's definitely how New Yorkers think of themselves. But, even when I think about, the reality of it being a center of fashion, with New York City Fashion Week is the kind of biggest fashion week, I think, in the world. When I think of finance, New York Stock Exchange, Wall Street, when I think of just entertainment, outside of LA, and in the States, New York is a place that, is just almost synonymous with lots of film and just culture and those type of things. Broadway, I mean, literally the street is synonymous with theater. And same goes for tech in just about every industry. New York Times, probably the most, significant newspaper in the country. And so in a lot of ways, there is this incredible vibrancy and energy and just a great sense of opportunity in the almost culmination of like human, potential being, captured and realized in one place that, is completely densely populated and but just bustling with the city that never sleeps. And so all of those things, and I'm saying this as someone, I was born and raised in Philly, like 90 miles south of here. And we kind of see ourselves in a lot of ways as the little brother to New York. So I didn't grow up with a great sense of fondness. That was kind of like, oh, they think they're so great. We're, you know what I mean? So that was kind of the mentality. But so I never thought I would live here. But having now moved here, and I could see, no, there's the order of magnitude of what it means to live in this city is very distinct than any other place that I've lived.
I wanted to ask, Rasool, does that go back to its kind of foundations as a city that was essentially, inhabited by immigrant communities who came to kind of make their life and, their futures there? Does that sort of ethos still persist in the people who kind of choose?
I would even go further back. When I first moved here, I watched a 20-part, I don't even know how many hour documentary from PBS that they did on New York City. And one of the things and you learn from there is that, and again, just to compare this to like Philadelphia, right, which was founded by a Quaker, to escaping religious persecution in England. And so like ideas and freedom of religion and things like that are very much, emphasized in the city. And it has that kind of ethos. I think when the Dutch settlers came to New Amsterdam, as they would call it, they saw the harbor in one of the biggest natural harbors in the world. And they thought, oh, this would be a great place to do business. And so when they, ended up, and this gets controversial about, when the Native Americans here sold, I put that in quotations because, how do you, I don't even think they had the same concept of what it meant to sell land. But when they sold it, it immediately became thought of as a commercial enterprise. They weren't interested in ideas or freedoms. It was about business. And ever since that has been the core identity of New York City is business in that way. And so I think on the one end, you do get the thriving immigrant population in the story, Ellis Island, the Statue of Liberty, that does become a part of it. But I think that's related because it's like, hey, can you do the work? We need more folks to do work. So whereas a lot of other places in the country might have been more standoffish because they want to protect this idea of culture, in New York City, it was about getting the job done. Now, I would say the flip side is also true, is that you see the underside, the undercarriage, the underbelly in a lot of ways of this kind of capitalistic enterprise, where you see the, I guess you could see the homelessness and despair and poverty and struggle that also has come alongside of all of these amazing, skyscrapers and advancement, that there's a certain, beyond sharp elbows, but a certain type of, I would say even darkness that can, just show a lack of compassion and just a lack of support for those who are the most vulnerable in its city walls. And all of those things are held together. And I think sometimes people want to create an overly simplistic definition of the city, but the reality, there's a statement that they say is 8 million stories in the city. And so depending on which ones you pick from, you can find great stories of inspiration or struggle.
I mean, tell me if this is another oversimplistic take on New York, but I've heard it said that, New York kind of has had various phases, and it was actually, there was a period in the 70s and 80s when, it was seen at least as a fairly crime-ridden kind of place, and not the kind of place you would want to go as a tourist. But somehow that kind of all got turned around in the 90s and early 2000s, and actually it became a pretty safe place, and really rose as a kind of tourist destination for the world. So, I mean, is that true? Where do you see the city now? And I guess this is a city in a kind of post-COVID world as well, which obviously had its own peculiar effect on it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it reveals once again the complexity of a place with 8 million plus now 8.5 million people. Is in one sense, and I think it talks about what spaces you're referring to. So when people think about Times Square, which from a tourist standpoint is the first place you want to go when you come to New York City, and for a local is the last place you want to go, because for tourists, it's the first place they want to go. And so I remember making that adjustment myself and being amazed at the lights and whatnot, and then realizing I can't get anywhere quickly because you're talking about 200,000 pedestrians per day. And for people that like efficiency, like New Yorkers, it's just a completely frustrating place, especially when they're all staring up into the sky, wandering aimlessly, trying to figure out where to go. And so New Yorkers avoid Times Square like the plague. But because it's almost one of the most iconic locations physically in the city, and definitely in the 70s and 80s, that particular location was ridden with all sorts of porn, stops and shops there, drugs, violence. I mean, or crime. Like those were places that it was associated with that. But at the same time, I think about the 70s. I'm a hip hop head, right? And so, as somebody who grew up, just a fan of hip hop emerges in the context of the folks who, could not gain access to instruments because budgets were cut in schools. They come up with their own way. These immigrants, mostly from Afro-Caribbean context and African-American context, they come together and they create this, what is now a global, art form, out of that sense of need. And so I think, and that's just one example, but so I think when you look into the, neighborhoods of Brooklyn or Queens, there wasn't the same type of feeling of crisis per se that you might have in Times Square, but because that is more associated with the identity of the city and the tourism, that particular story arc of 70s, 80s, rough, now great, and safe, is the thing that is most kind of associated with it. But I would say in general, you always had your ups and downs in it, but, in safety. But then there's also gentrification that comes with that. And what does it mean to have folks who cannot even afford to live in the city that they grew up in anymore because the rent is out of control and people are being displaced. And so which time period is the time period that they look upon with nostalgia? The one where they were struggling financially, but it was home and it felt like a sense of community, or the one in which they have to make hard choices to leave it because the property values are so high? So that's kind of some of the complexity that I think I try to hold together in our congregation, which is mostly, our average age is about 28 years old, 80% single, and very diverse ethnically and culturally. So in that space, you also have people that are coming all the time from all over the world, and they have their own stories to kind of sift through.
Yeah. I was just trying to kind of put it into context, because you say, how many? 8 billion?
8.5 million.
8.5 million.
Yeah.
I live in a country that has 3.1 million. My whole country. So that is incredible. And there must be such a feeling of, or I may be wrong, but culture is made in places like New York. And so there's like this seriousness of what happens here matters, because for better or for worse, it will trickle out. Like, we are change makers here. And that's quite a weight to live within,
I think so. It's a weight, but also it draws people who want to make that kind of impact in the world, who come here to have that type of impact in the world. And so, and I would say myself, like, I read, it was funny. While I was on the way here, I moved to New York City from Indiana. That's where I've been doing ministry. My last location before here, I was reading Jane K.A. Smith's How Not to Be Secular. And I remember the first sentence was like, so you just moved to Brooklyn from the Midwest to play in a church. And I was like, oh my gosh, he's like
he's
reading
read
my
mail.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. But I remember feeling that same type of enthusiasm that he captured in that book about, I want to go into the secular city. I want to, understand and deepen my understanding of how faith can translate in this place and can thrive here and actually answer some of the deepest questions and longings that find themselves. But I also realize I need to be formed by this place too. And that I'm not just coming in with, a cape on to try to, rescue the city. It will humble you very quickly. And you realize I need to sit with some of the complexity of what it means in a postmodern, urban, secular context to live out faith there. And I would say in these 8 years that New York has given me that opportunity and challenge. And I think it is also simultaneously, I have felt the confidence and the joy of feeling like I am contributing something to the world and inspiring others who want to make these contributions. Because at our church, we've had folks, in Hamilton and Broadway and acting and, that just come through. And so to equip folks in those spaces with kind of biblical principles to live by is something that is exciting.
Does the Bridge Church, where you're the teaching pastor, then in that sense reflect the kind of demography of the city, and I guess Brooklyn specifically? You say it's a young congregation. It's a largely single congregation. There's obviously people who are coming to New York to make their name, do their thing, and a lot of kind of obviously through flow because of that. And I guess that's quite a different kind of prospect to pastor a church like that than say your average, suburban church in the suburbs of Chicago or somewhere, So what are the joys and challenges, I suppose, of that particular type of church?
Yeah, I think we in some ways embody the, kind of zeitgeist, I guess you could say, of the current realities of what we think of synonymous with urbanness, which is, increasingly, especially in the States, younger populations, ethnically diverse populations, and those who are, financially struggling. You can't, unless you are, making a whole lot of money, probably close to $1 million a year, you can't even buy a house here. Like, it's just, so you're renting and you're trying to build a life. So I think in those ways, we do reflect a certain aspect of the city. At the same time, every borough, like I said, is different in every neighborhood. And so I would not lay claim to like we are New York City in microcosm. I would say probably about 60% of our population is Afro-Caribbean and African-American. So just to kind of give you a sense of the difference, right, of even how that hit me. So, I've been a part of historically Black churches, both multi-ethnic churches, as well. But this was the first context I ever was in. When I remember when I first Sunday, and folks who mostly look like me were like, "Hey, so where are you from?" And I was like, "I'm from Philly." And they're like, "No, but like, where are your people from?" And they wanted to know what island that my folks came from. Now the dreadlocks probably didn't help, right? Associated with Jamaica or Haiti. But the idea was, as opposed to Harlem, where the majority African American population, Black population, is African American, meaning that been here for generations. In Brooklyn, the majority Black population is Afro-Caribbean. And so they're 1 or 2 generations removed from the islands. And so even to the point where they just naturally assume, because, 80% of the people there that would fit the bill. So that's kind of a nice, interesting, like little slice into how I think about culture. That was somewhat what I studied academically. And I continue to be fascinated by from a vocational standpoint, ministerially. And so I do think that the growing vision of what does it look like for us across, but even within Afro-Caribbean, there's still diversity. Don't get a Haitian confused with a Jamaican, right? And because they're very distinct. But then beyond that, when you go into South America, Asia, European American, which we have all of those represented at our church, it has been an incredibly fun space to live out what Christian community can look like across those different dynamics.
I guess every Christian will look and sound as different as the sort of context they come from in a way, but how easy would you say it is to be a Christian in New York City? Is it a place where it's tough to kind of remain distinctive in that sense, in that kind of center of culture and fast-moving life, and I guess very often a kind of very progressive attitude to things culturally and socially?
I think it's a complicated, and I have that. You'll start to see a theme here. I try to, one of my favorite words is nuance.
Love that.
Yeah, and so in some sense, it can be challenging because there is definitely, the kind of, I feel like New York is like 10 years ahead of the Midwest in terms of its cultural framework and its, ideas, or even further from the Deep South, more like probably the West Coast, but more intellectually, refined or exacting in kind of its positions. And so in a lot of ways, it is a post-Christian context in terms of, the primary frame that people have definitely working in the city. And when I say the city, that's referring to Manhattan. There are 5 boroughs, okay, right? So Manhattan is what most people think of, that's where Wall Street is and Broadway. Then to the north of that is the Bronx, and we're what we call the outer boroughs, Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island. And so in the city where this kind of like hub of business and enterprise is happening, in a lot of ways you could feel very isolated in trying to figure out what it means to live out your faith. And definitely there are different convictions that we have about in seeing the world that would be considered out of step, old-fashioned, even offensive. And yet at the same time, I do think that we also see that desire and hunger for re-enchantment in the places that we live. Like there's almost this intrigue that can be there with folks who are living so counterculturally, and that they are curious, about how we live. And I think that there's opportunities if we come to that with a humble confidence, a humble boldness. I think there are opportunities where we can lean into that. And this is what I learned in college. I went to University of Pennsylvania and undergrad, and they talked a lot about the marketplace of ideas, right? And this campus is the marketplace of ideas. And I quickly learned that even though that there was some suspicion about this old idea of a ordered, created universe with a personal God who sought and wanted relationship with us, that it still was something that I could come into my classroom and present because that was an idea. And I had to do so kind of shrewdly, knowing the backstory of how those ideas had been critiqued and seen as harmful in the past, so I can kind of lean into the new one. But I think when we equip people with a better story, a better vision, then I think we can often see, those opportunities. Now, again, part of the reason I mentioned Manhattan in particular is because Brooklyn is known as the borough of churches. Because, in Queens, you're talking significant immigrant populations who bring with them significant faith traditions, and not just Christian, of course. There's over 1 million Muslims that live in New York City. There's some, major, Buddhist temples and Sikh and all the different things. And so there is a certain type of story that we tend to think of that's like the Sex in the City, kind of vision. And that definitely exists, but that's not the only story that exists as well. It's all these things coming together. We do need to create a robust, really confident, thoughtful expression of the faith that to equip believers with in this place. And when they find that, I think that they can thrive.
If you enjoy listening to Re-enchanting, then you'll probably enjoy our other two podcasts from Seen and Unseen. Seen and Unseen Aloud is a weekly dose of commentary on culture, trends, and current affairs. God Pod is a deeper dive into theology and faith, hosted by Graham Tomlin, Jane Williams, and Michael Lloyd. You can find them wherever you get your podcasts from. For now, back to today's episode of Re-enchanting. I mean, just before Belle comes in with a question, this is the one I've been wanting to ask, so apologies if I take this one, Belle, but
go ahead.
The pastor that many people, especially in the evangelical world, associate with New York is, of course, the late Tim Keller.
Yep.
His ministry there, in Manhattan. And a lot of people would say, he kind of showed this open, winsome posture towards skeptics that made his ministry so successful and made Redeemer flourish. But he did get criticized towards the end of his ministry by some who said, well, the culture has moved on from this sort of neutral place towards Christianity. They talk about it going from a kind of positive, relationship with Christianity to this neutral space. But now we're in this very post-Christian, actually negative, hostile place. And so some of his critics were saying it's time to drop this whole winsome approach, and you've just got to get stuck into the culture wars. Basically, you've got to. This is about confronting something. So where do you stand in all that as a someone I'm sure who knew of Tim's ministry and perhaps even met him once or twice?
So I'll start with this. I had the incredible opportunity of sitting under Dr. Tim Keller's teaching multiple times. I enrolled at Reformed Theological Seminary in New York City, which he essentially brought to the city, desiring to see a strong Orthodox seminary in the city. Not to say that there are other ones that existed, but that was kind of his vision, especially from a Reformed tradition. And our church, Bridge Church, was actually part of the city-to-city network. And so when our lead pastor first moved into the city, we were part of that city-to-city incubator, which was laying out this very thoughtful and I think effective model for church planning. So both organizationally, I've been affiliated, but personally, as I took Christians in secular culture class with him, I took a class with him in Ligon Duncan as well. And in the process of that, got to see up close and engage with his ideas and thoughts. And even he, gave me feedback for the article, Critical Grace Theory, that I wrote, and I sent it to him. We interacted via email about things, which I'm like, this is amazing that I get to get his kind of eye and feedback. And I think, and I also, just so on a personal level, I mean, he has shaped my thinking, I think, philosophically and even, I would say, theologically about culture in the city significantly. And when you go back and listen to his sermons and writings, there is never a sense where there's just this idea of neutrality of the culture. Like, there's always a recognition of the contrast between a thoughtful biblical perspective in some of the themes and ideas, right? And tracking those ideas probably better than I've ever seen a pastor track from Foucault and from, Derrida and all of the kind of postmodern thinkers, and connecting those things and to our faith and understanding how they got there. There was never a illusion of, they just kind of have a vague sensibility about. No, it was always very clear, down to the quotation marks, about this contrast that there was. I think that this culture war framework is more about a certain angst that exists in the church in the West of feelings of loss because of our numbers have dwindled and because we are seeing, the closings of churches, even Christian colleges, like in the last couple of years. King's College in New York City and Nyack both, folded and went under. Those were, significant Christian colleges that were here when I got here, and they are no longer. And so there is a clear sense when you look at the modern perspectives on sexual ethics, on, just beliefs about the world, like across the board, there is a sense in which secularization is upon us. But that was the case in the 1980s and the 1990s and early 2000s when Tim was teaching. And I think that our reaction to those things is the thing that is shifted, and the politicization of this desire for a strong man. This is kind of where I feel like Dr. Soong-Chan Rah in his book, The Next Evangelicalism, where he talks about how the church in the West is held as, we're in cultural captivity. And we're in cultural captivity. And again, this is where you have to kind of specifically, Soong-Chan Rah is talking about, when he says the church in the West, he means primarily white evangelical institutions that have assumed certain, cultural frames in addition to the theological ones. And I think are feeling the instability of all of a sudden a kind of dominance that existed before that is no longer there. What Soong-Chan Rah offers us to do in that book, and then also Prophetic Lament, the book that he's very much known for, reintroducing the idea of lament into the Western context, is to recognize that we have a lot to reflect and to grieve about the history of the past. The things that are turning people off and away from the church aren't just the ideas of Marx and Freud, and Nietzsche. It's also what actually happened. And I think this is where Soong-Chan Rah's perspective about the contributions of ethnic minority churches is so important and profound, because the same kind of angst and hand-wringing that exists from a loss of power and influence that exists oftentimes in majority evangelical spaces don't exist in the same way in the Black church, because we're always a minority voice. Like the prophetic voice of the church being crying out in the wilderness is more of a muscle memory that I think exists. And I think there's an opportunity there. But I also am very concerned about the cultural captivity of what it looks like for church and politics and to kind of wed itself with strong men. I'll say this last part. Like I said, I had a lot to say about this. But I think about two moments in the Old Testament story that I always try to find myself in the biblical story, right? And I think about when the nation of Israel was feeling this sense of angst and being overwhelmed by the dominant nations around them. And they said to Samuel, we want a king like the other nations. And the king that they pick is the tallest, most distinct person that they could find in Saul, who stood a head taller than the rest of the Israelites. And they see, this is our champion. And Samuel is grieved because he wants God to be their king. And of course, we see it. What happens is disaster. This outward physical presence and sense of intimidation is not what advances them forward. In fact, it sets them back. And so what God chooses is someone who is the least, likely, right? His dad doesn't even see him as a potential candidate. And he selects this guy because he was a man after God's own heart. I think about the prophetic books and the exile. And once again, this moment where, okay, well, Hezekiah is like, well, maybe we should align ourselves to the nations so that we can protect ourselves politically and socially. And that's exactly their downfall and their doom. And instead, what, Jeremiah and Isaiah kind of emphasizes, there's going to be a tender shoot of David that's going to rise up. And he's going to be the one through his brokenness that will allow us to flourish. And then finally, you see it in the New Testament with Jesus himself being, that one chilling statement that we see from Caiaphas, the high priest, well, should one man, isn't it better for one man to die than the whole nation, be taken and lost from us? He's thinking about this in nationalistic terms. He's thinking about this in pragmatic terms. And in doing so, he unwittingly, participates in the crucifixion of the one who's the Prince of Peace, who comes not riding on a horse like Saul, but riding on a donkey. And that is the King of Kings that we serve. And I think we have to go back to being okay with the loss of power, to not see it as this sense of a existential crisis that most people aren't church going, that most people don't start from a biblical worldview, that somehow we can recapture what was lost and recognize that the church at its best in the early centuries is the one that has the confidence of knowing that what it believes, even without the tangible benefits of a society that cosigns on what it is. And I think we have to really look at ethnic minority churches who are already in that experience of being a minority to see some of the insights that we can learn about what does it look like to be okay with being a prophetic minority as opposed to trying to hold on to power and wed ourselves with entities that we think will save us and protect that power, but will actually corrupt us continually.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. That makes me think of a few things. Firstly, this whole idea of the decline of Christianity is such a Western thing. Like, it's just not the whole world. It's not the whole story. And actually, the fastest growing church is still the persecuted one. There are more persecuted Christians than there ever have been in recorded history. And it's the fastest growing church, which is just nuts, which is kind of like tapping into what you said about this whole, actually, where is faith flourishing? It's when the power is against it, not fueling it and driving it forward, which is fascinating. And it also made me think, last season, we had an amazing conversation with Lisa Fields, who I know you know well and have worked with. And she was speaking about, in her apologetics, she was speaking about informational and incarnational. And it's kind of like that we as nodding like, yeah, that's her line. That is, that's her gold. And just this idea of we can put out as much information as we like, but if we somewhere along the line have stopped having this incarnational kind of witness, if we've stopped looking like what we're talking about in whatever way, then it's kind of game over, which is interesting.
Lisa and the Jude 3 project that she's founded, I think, is one of the most important voices today in the church. And I think part of what I was saying, because it might sound harsh to people, the way I talked about Soong Chan Ra's insight about the Western dominant church being in cultural captivity, but her own story bears this out. I mean, she talks about how after being confronted with, kind of secular ideas about Christianity in college that kind of challenged her faith, she committed herself to this aspect of apologetics, goes to Liberty University, looks for mentors, and is told, you're a Black woman, there's no place for you in this world, which is shocking. And then you look at that world and you go, well, it was, technically true in the sense that there was not space, but from a vision and ministry standpoint, how awful of that, how much of a loss would we have experienced if she would have listened to that and not continued on? And that's some of what I'm saying about some of the blinders. But the other thing, I think there's no coincidence that one of the leading women in apologetics is also giving us this insight about emotional intelligence, right? Like the fact that, it doesn't just matter like information, but we also have to have these important insights about engagement and what people are really, where they are and why they have the oppositions that they do. And I say this as somebody that was very much informed by apologetics and followed and read and all of those things. No shade on that. But at the same time, there is this sometimes very proud, intellectually arrogant approach that we have to think that if I just give people the right information, that's going to change their mind. That I think Lisa has really contributed to helping model what does it look like to have conversations, and been criticized for the fact that she'll have these dialogues. We did one called Why I Don't Go, where she did this series where she invited people who stopped going to church to conversation about why they, stopped going and what were their perspectives. And then after about an hour of that dialogue, she then brings in herself and like a pastor or another leader to respond to them. And people have criticized, why would you put these ideas out there about people's reservations or critiques of Christianity. But I can tell you, as somebody who participated in it, I saw the light bulbs go off just through the aspect of dialogue and through the emotional intelligence of what it means to actually hear someone's story, to empathize with it and respond. And actually, one of the guys started coming to my church who was in the Why I Don't Go to Church thing. We fellowshiped several times because he had built up a sense of trust with us. And I think those are some of the important insights that also show us that there isn't just one story here. And definitely when we look at the global South and, in Africa and Latin America and as well as Asia, that there are aspects of growth that we can learn from, and we need to empower financially. We need to empower, in terms of influence, and that's part of what would take to get out of this cultural captivity.
Yeah, I've appreciated the way in which you've embodied as well that kind of willingness to have relationships and talk across the divides and so on. You kindly joined me for a discussion some years ago, very much in the wake of the George Floyd demonstrations and the Black Lives Matters and kind of the growing conversation at that point, though it hadn't really reached its apex at that point, this growing conversation around what people were starting to call critical race theory. Now, at the time, I had you on with someone who was very critical of critical race theory. You had just published, though, and you referenced it earlier as something that you sent to Tim Keller as well, but this really interesting article called Critical Grace Theory. Tell us about that and what you were trying to do in that moment as these issues were starting to come up.
Yeah. So as somebody who, I was very involved with thoughts of race and racial justice my parents were in the Nation of Islam when I was born. That's where my name Rasool comes from. And they were mostly committed on this vision and attractiveness of social uplift, not so much, the religious components. So when I came to faith, my senior year in high school, kind of coming into my freshman year in college, those sensibilities were there with me, but then not just because of that awareness of social injustice and what I had learned, but also just going to a predominantly white college in which my own presence on the campus was questioned. This was at the height of debates about affirmative action in the 90s and people just assuming I was at Ivy League school because, I got in through some quota system, but not because I deserved, just because I was there. And kind of having these type of experiences prompted me to just understand why were these divides there? Why were these assumptions there? Why were the things that we experienced wrong in the world there? And so I ended up getting a degree in Africana Studies and sociology to kind of understand those things. And so I kind of put it on the shelf when I got into evangelical world and just was sharing my faith and doing discipleship on campus and those kind of things. But then when Trayvon Martin, was killed by George Zimmerman, when Michael Brown, death and, just the tragedy of it and, kind of inflamed things in Ferguson, Missouri, I all of a sudden started to realize that there was a huge understanding divide in the evangelical spaces I was in between understanding the racial history and how to communicate it. And so that was going back to 2015. I began to really kind of lean into those conversations. So George Floyd happened, and our church, our congregation was traumatized. I was it was a pastoral concern for us to respond to, not just it wasn't even political. It was primarily this is a crisis, a trauma, a collective trauma that we have to shepherd our people through. Especially because as being, like I said, significantly even Afro-Caribbeans, they had varying levels of understanding of those conversations in their own homes, as sometimes being the children of immigrants. And so it was very much something that we started to lean into. And in the midst of that, when I first started hearing these, kind of dismissals of our attempts to articulate a Christian response to racial injustice in our world as CRT, I actually was kind of confused. I was like, what is this that you're saying? And then I kind of looked it up. Oh, it's just some obscure legal theory. Okay, whatever. I don't need that in order to talk about what I'm doing. I've been talking about this for decades. And so with critical grace theory, my approach was similar to the moves I'd seen with postmodernism or any other controversial idea that emerges, is that you realize that because of common grace, that there's the ability for us to learn from scholars and thinkers who are not necessarily Christian. That doesn't mean we have to absorb and embrace every insight that they have, but we can learn from them. And so we did this with postmodernism, right? And I think for example, in postmodernism, the insight about, questioning our quote unquote objectivity and realizing that there is some level of subjectivity that each person brings, I think is a very, very much fits in with our understanding of human frailty and brokenness in the fall, right? And so in the same way, why can't we learn or gain an insight about the nature of the fall's impact on not just how we as individuals look at other individuals sinfully and that with bias, but that we've created systems that do the same thing. I mean, we know this through very historical facts like redlining, which prevented Black people's homes from being, insured by mortgages, which had a significant impact on the transfer of wealth, and why today Black middle-class people have 10 times less the wealth of white middle-class people in the United States of America because of the legacy of these practices. And so segregation, all of these things. So I'm like, these are insights that, are being spoken about by critics of racial injustice, some of whom identify in this CRT camp, some of whom don't. But you can just use the insights from Martin Luther King Jr. or, from Frederick Douglass to get to some of the same conclusions. So my attempt in critical grace theory was to say, hey, there are some things we can critique about any theory. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore the underlying complaint that exists because of its association that some people may link it to another ideology. And so that's what I was trying to do with critical grace theory.
It's an incredible piece of writing, an incredible resource. I would, point everyone towards it. Another one, which I watched last night, is Juneteenth, Faith and Freedom. And I just want to talk about that. And I want to talk about all of it, but in particular, what struck me, like right from the beginning, was, can I quote you to you? Will you hate this? But right at the beginning, when you open it up, you say, so I'm here for myself, a descendant of slaves, for my country that was built with their hands, and for my Christian faith, which was used to justify slavery and yet became an inspiration for liberation. And the whole time I watched Juneteenth, I was struck by how, just the contrast of that. There was evidence after piece of evidence, just story after story after story of the way that Christianity was used as a means of justifying slavery, and then story after story of the way that churches were the first place that people went to go and celebrate on Juneteenth, and that a church was actually the first institution that liberated people went and founded, and all of these things. And just, this is a huge question. So, and I am expecting a beautifully nuanced answer, as is your signature style. But just, can you just talk me through the way that you are able to sit in that contrast, in that tension, in knowing that two things are true at once, and you refusing to like tip the scales, if you know what I mean, refusing to discount the other reality?
Yeah, no, I thank you. And one of the reasons why we thought Juneteenth, Faith and Freedom could be of help to the body of Christ in this time was not only just to educate people about a holiday, but to inspire believers to know what it feels like and to model what it feels like to live in the tension. We live in all these beautiful tensions in Scripture, right? I think of our realized eschatology and the already not yet tension, right? Jesus is already risen and is already Lord, but he's not yet fully consummated that is our King. And so our world of living in that in between place is one that is both filled with moments of incredible pride and incredible shame, and that comes to our national stories as well. And so for me, I see elements of that in the biblical story throughout. Like, the nation of Israel can look at moments and be very grateful of God's, kind of specifically blessing Abraham, being in covenant relationship. But then there's some great moments of horror and dread, that are there. And in the same way with the church. And I think the thing that keeps me rooted is that it would be disconcerting if the strategies or techniques that we would need to employ to find hope in hard situations, especially as it relates to the witness of the church, was a new innovation that we had to lean into in 21st century times. But the reality is it's been there the entire time. It's been part of the story as God is striven to work with man and humanity. And so, what do we do with the fact that, it is the people who were screaming, Hosanna, Hosanna on Palm Sunday, who then starts crying out, crucify him on Good Friday, right? Like, what do we do with the fact that the very people that Jesus critiques as hypocrites and a brood of vipers are the teachers and leaders who he also tells them do what they say, but not what they do, right? Like, so there's this recognition of the validity of, of the faith, while at the same time, a recognition of the fact that there's corruption within it and that Jesus was himself an outsider in that system. And so that gives me hope that as I look and have to navigate and try to understand how is it that those who identify themselves as Christians committed chapter and verse to, a kind of righteous orthodoxy in theological terms in some ways, had an ethical or, teaching and theology that was far below the opposite of orthodox. And I think there's a saying in a Black church that you got to eat the meat and spit out the bones when you hear a sermon, right? Or you hear some idea that a Christian teacher, kind of articulates that you don't, like there's some truth there, but then there's some things that are not true there, right? And so you got to eat the meat and spit out the bones. And so I think that has been our legacy. And I think that the Spirit of God is the ultimate kind of standard for helping us understand what's meat and what's bones, not the tradition and just the witness of even those who claim to know Christ. Because I think that I think part of the reason why this is such a big issue with the world, apart from the fact that, yes, it's a bad look when those who say, I'm here for God, are also saying, and that's why I'm going to take your land and I'm going to rape your women and I'm going to enslave you, right? Like, but I'm doing this for God. Like, that's just going to be a bad witness. But I also think that some of the naive optimism of the innate goodness of humanity that's embedded in humanism uniquely shortcuts people's ability to see how this is possible. And so the only thing they blame is faith or the doctrines of the church. Whereas if you have a really robust, I think, biblical understanding of human nature and anthropology, then you realize it's not a surprise to me that humans will take anything, even the good news of the gospel, and use it as a form of oppression. And so, but that's not the end of the story. And in fact, it is actually discrediting, adding to the marginalization of the past to only center that story, as the left often does, to say, look, this is what bad happened when people had beliefs about the church. So, beliefs about God that they thought were absolute. They ended up oppressing people. So therefore, we should not have absolute beliefs about truth. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. There are also people who had a very progressive understanding of justice and righteousness, who were also very committed. One of the most life-changing moments for me was reading the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. After railing in his book and talking about how his enslaver became more brutal after his alleged conversion. He then, in his appendix, starts out by saying, I love the pure, peaceable Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the hypocritical slave women, slave stealing, women stealing, abusive, hypocritical Christianity of this land. In fact, he calls it the greatest of libels and slanders that you would even call the religion of this land, Christianity of Christ. And so I'm looking at this person who we know is the great liberator, and I'm seeing in real time, he's seeing a distinction and saying, okay, what are the merits of what this thing actually is supposed to be in the scripture? And what is the culture telling me? And when there's a gap between the two of those things, I'm able to see, eat the meat and spit out the bones. So I think that that's the tradition that we have as believers.
And it's the Juneteenth documentary is such a helpful way of processing that conflicted history in the church when it comes to its history with slavery and so on. I mean, just for those who the very name Juneteenth may be the first time they're hearing that, there's a lot of obviously listeners who will be familiar with that, but plenty here in the UK, I imagine, who maybe haven't even heard of it. What specific anniversary is Juneteenth about? Could you tell us?
Sure. Yeah. So Juneteenth is what they call portmanteau. So it's a kind of combination of June and 19th put together. So that's where the word Juneteenth comes from. And it's a celebration and acknowledgement of a very pivotal day, June 19, 1865 in Galveston, Texas. So many people are taught wrongly, even in the United States. I was taught this, that essentially slavery ended in the United States with the adoption of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a presidential order from Abraham Lincoln in the height of the Civil War. And so he wrote it in November. It came into effect January 1, 1863. Well, because it was a presidential order specifically targeting the Confederacy, who had rejected and rebelled against the Union, it wasn't like when they got the news that they said, oh, okay, now we got to stop having slaves because, the president that we're rebelling against, told us to. And so what ended up happening is it took 2.5 years for the abolition of slavery in Texas to actually be able to be enforced. It took that long for the Union Army, to get to, which at that point was the far extreme southwest of the United States, and also in a state that was virulently pro-slavery, and really kind of envisioned a racial caste system as part of its society. It took that long for it to get there. And so June 19, 1865, General Gordon Granger of the Union and a squadron of Black soldiers come to liberate this African-American community and what is kind of the last stand of slavery in the Confederacy. And immediately, as one could imagine, celebrations unfold there. And one of the reasons why we think this is a spiritual story, and this has everything to do with re-enchantment, is with our daily bread, like literally we're taking that idea of daily and seeing the aspect of encountering God in unique ways each day. And in the same way that with something like Thanksgiving, that you can, even though it's a secular holiday, it's something that you can very easily see the significance of, from a spiritual standpoint, of giving thanks to God and being thankful for all the things that He's provided. One of the early names for Juneteenth, it went by a lot of nicknames. Freedom Day, Emancipation Day, was Jubilee Day. And that was what blew my mind, because these formerly emancipated folks, at a time when it was illegal to teach an enslaved person how to read, somehow got the story of Leviticus 25, that in what I call the Super Bowl of Sabbaths, that God had ordained and arranged for folks to be freed from bondage and from slavery in the Bible, thus showing you a lot of the heart of God's posture toward justice in the world and freedom and liberation for people, and that they took hold of that and they experienced this sense of jubilation. And that was part of the reason why they experienced it as a divine deliverance, not just something that was a political or military reality. And so we thought, how valuable is it for us to lean into that story, not only to see what it looks like to understand the story of Juneteenth, but what can it look like for us as believers to maintain and hold hope, even in the face of incredible injustice, incredible suffering, and incredible odds. And I think that's a story that can help us really recapture what I say our swagger in our culture. We're at a time where folks feel so beleaguered and pessimistic about the world that there's real reason for us to have hope, because we have this story of those who had hope. And I don't know how difficult it is to be a Christian in New York City in 2024, but I know however it is not as hard as what it was to be enslaved in Texas in 1865, right? And so if folks in that space can hold on to hope, maybe it can give us some inspiration for us to be able to lean into our times as well and realize God has a good word for us, a word of jubilee.
That's so good. And of course, I'm assuming, I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming that the year of Jubilee and anything pertaining to it is definitely one of the sections that were ripped out of the Bible, that those people were allowed. So that just the fact that that story was in the air they breathed is beautiful. I think you speak to one historian, and I'm so sorry that I've forgotten her name, but she just says, God was in the mix.
Yes.
And that perfectly encaptured, the whole documentary and the way that he was, and the tension of it and the contradiction of it and the jubilation of it and the reality of it was just that God was in the mix.
Amen. That's a great way to summarize it. God was in the mix, and he still is.
Still is, absolutely.
As we come to the end of this really, really interesting conversation with you, Rasool, I guess the hope that sustained enslaved people, even in their time of trial, and that continued to fire, the emancipation of the civil rights movement and beyond. We are now entering another tricky moment, especially in the US, an election year, where there are lots of divisive issues on the table, lots of tribalism, politicization, culture wars that we've already talked about. How do we channel that same hope, if you like, to kind of somehow do something different, tell a better story, as you said, than the one that we're probably going to be hearing a lot about in the coming months?
Yes. Lord help us. Lord help us. That's my prayer in 2024. I think that we have to, in, like I said, Soong Chan Ra's idea of, liberating the church from cultural captivity, I think starts with doing a different model than what we see because part of the politicization has meant increasing polarization, and there's this weird, dangerous technique of essentially demonizing opponents, right? And creating the worst possible explanation for their motives and for their intentions and for the outcomes of things. And in a lot of ways, those affiliated or, with the church, and of course, the data shows a more nuanced story when it comes to some of those perspectives. And what I mean by that is some of the most polarizing people on the right or on the left are also not church going, are not the most engaged in discipleship systems. But those stories they identify, almost see evangelicalism as a tribe, but not as they don't see spiritual formation as a lived experience. But I think in a lot of ways, our culture has allowed that phenomenon to occur because of the individualism that sees someone being able to have an identity apart from any kind of collective and cohesive practice. So in the midst of all that, I would say succinctly, we need to listen to other people in the body of Christ who disagree. I mean, there's a strand of folks who say, well, if you vote for this party, especially evangelical circles, if you vote for Democrats, then that means you're not a Christian, or that no Christian could possibly do that. I think that kind of mentality very much undermines what the process is of us telling a different story, right? In terms of, being able to listen to more complex, and that's across the board. And so I've learned a long time ago that this zero-sum game of, like voting for this person is the epitome of all that I believe and hope for in the world, is like saying I have all my hopes in Saul to rescue us from, the Philistines. And I think God tells us a better story, that we have a hope in the King of Kings. And so we should engage in a political process, but we should do so very much bringing other people to the table. And also there's this, I think one of the biggest things is losing a vision for the church to actually be able to be involved and invested in some of the solutions that we now point government to try to solve completely. Like, why am I looking to government to save a sense of a biblical morality in the country, or to defend, what I understand to be, a biblical vision for, marriage or something? Like, I mean, and again, I'm not saying that we should get involved in the political sphere. I definitely do believe that, but I think hope in our like what will save society is kind of interwoven, and I think been syncretized with this aspect of the kingdom of God and what we can try to do to make happen. And so I think my hope is that as we lean into these things, that, we recognize government is there for our good, that we ought to, as best we can, be aware of the issues. I think this is a very simple thing, but our value for truth and objective truth should undermine misinformation and should undermine distortions of reality. I think for Christians just to say, whether I agree with this person or not, that, and I guess now post Super Tuesday, it's pretty much going to be Biden or Trump, from a presidential standpoint or whatever, whether I agree with that person's policies or not, what I won't sit by is allow someone to mischaracterize them and to misrepresent what they said. Like, let's hold on to reality and to truth. But the last part, that our church launched something called Pray March Act in the wake of the George Floyd murder, and it's a just an opportunity for Christians to live out our call to do good in the city and to promote justice and human flourishing. And one of the things that we have learned with that, and we've actually partnered with City to City to do various events of civic literacy and engagement. And one of the things that I think is related to that whole putting our misplaced trust in the strong man or strong woman is the reality that all politics is local. When I start to understand, like, we had to adjust and respond to when 100,000 migrants, descended upon our city in a year's time, like, getting onto the ground level of what that actually meant, what people's needs actually were, what were the root causes, it helps to resolve some of the hyper politicized versions of those stories, because it's easier to do that when we're so far away, not proximate at all. And I think that's one of the things Sam Alberry talks about, about why our bodies matter. And it's just like our physical space that we inhabit. Like, there are things about your broken roads or what Brexit means in Wales that I won't know from afar because I don't live there. Like, I don't see it. I'm not around it. And so I think instead of just getting some, spicy text or tweet from someone railing about it, like, why don't I talk to somebody who's actually lived it and experienced it so that I can get more informed about it. And I think that alone, that process, I think is a very Christian way. But then the last part is that my hope is not in what happens. I don't know what's going to happen in November 2024. I have things that I hope will happen, but at the end of the day, that's a lowercase hope, not a capital H hope. And we need to get back to being disconnected from feeling like, all right, one last line. I'm gonna say this because this is so frustrating to me, and I think this is part of the syncretization that happens. And I don't think there's any other country in the world. I'm so glad I'm talking about this to folks that are not from here. This idea that America is the city on a hill, and this is something that every president that I've been alive have reiterated this phrase is so, to be blasphemous. It's like Jesus was talking about the body of Christ, not the United States of America. Like this, no, stop. We're not the city on a hill. The church is the city on a hill. And I think the conflation of an American identity or a nationalistic identity with a spiritual one is part of the problem. So we need to kind of, stop that and just put our focus and our hope on the church and allow that to our theology to influence our political ideology and not the other way around.
It's been so good because as you've been speaking, I've been thinking of that time, when Paul goes to Athens and he stands up in the marketplace of ideas and he kind of like looks out and he goes, I see that you're religious in every way. And then he just goes on a Jesus spiel. And you give me that sense in that kind of you look into culture and you're like, I see you and I see this and I see this. And I think just after this conversation, I'm just really thankful that you're keeping your eye on us.
And I've really appreciated just exactly what you said there, which is the best way you can actually get to know a situation and a place is by speaking to someone who's actually living it, who's there. And I feel like we've had that experience with you as well, Rasool. Certainly my Hollywood version of New York has definitely kind of been re-enchanted, and yeah, it's just been an absolute delight to talk through all of this with you today. So yeah, thank you so much for spending some time with us, and God bless you in your continuing ministry to the Gen Z, millennials, and everyone else in your part of the world. And we hope we can host you one day in our city at the top of Lambeth Palace Library one day.
I love it.
Well, thank you so much for listening to today's edition of the Re-enchanting podcast. As usual, Belle, people can find us on video, on podcasts. They can rate, they can review.
They can.
They can also, of course, support this podcast. We can't do this without the help of listeners and viewers. So if you want to do that, you can simply go to seenandunseen.com to support the podcast, and of course find out more about Rasool. We'll make sure there are links with today's show where you can find out some of those articles we've talked about, critical race theory, the Juneteenth documentary, and more besides. But for now, from myself, from Belle and Rasool, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. See you next time.